World War II by Chase Crumweedy. During the Roaring Twenties, many people were investing in the stock market due to America's rapid expanding economy. October 24th, 1929, also known as Black Thursday, the stock market crashed. Billions of dollars were lost, and the economy in America made a turn for the worse.
In the 1920s, there was a notion that the United States had entered what they called the new era of economic development. That the old rules of what went up would eventually come down. That those old rules no longer apply. They bought homes, they bought cars, and especially they bought stocks, in large part on the basis of borrowed money.
But the good times wouldn't last. October 24th, 1929, Black Thursday. The stock market crashed and continued to go down. Within a week, total market value had dropped $30 billion, roughly 10 times the amount of the federal budget. The result? Panic. President Herbert Hoover tried to calm things down, calling the collapse a passing incident in our national lives. He said things would be back to normal in just 60 days. But by then, the U.S. Depression had spread around the world.
As banks collapsed, and as the pain spread to the larger economy, thousands, then hundreds of thousands, then millions of people were laid off. Many of them lost their homes. They hit the road. They established squatter towns. These were tent villages where people lived underneath bridges by the sides of roads. They acquired the derisive name Hooverville in scorn of President Hoover.
Then in 1932, Hoover lost his re-election bid. The new president, Franklin D. Roosevelt.
By the beginning of 1933, when Franklin Roosevelt took office, the banking system of the United States was essentially paralyzed. The unemployment rate hit 25%. People were going hungry. The country was in a depression, but it was also in despair.
Roosevelt's solution? An aggressive public works policy nicknamed the New Deal.
The New Deal brought down the unemployment rate a little bit. It offered hope to those people who remained unemployed. It provided incomes for some people who didn't have incomes otherwise. It didn't make a serious dent in the Depression itself, but it did alleviate most of the despair that the Depression had engendered.
With a bit of hope, Americans weathered the economic storm, and by the end of the decade, real relief was on the way as American industry geared up for World War II.
January 30th, 1933. Hitler becomes the Chancellor of Germany and sets out to regain land that once belonged to Germany, such as Austria. March 4th, 1933. President Franklin D. Roosevelt became the 32nd president. He addresses the American people stating, "We have nothing to fear but fear itself," regarding the Great Depression. September 1st, 1939. Hitler invades Poland from the west to expand his territory. September 3rd, 1939. France and Britain declare war on Germany in response to the invasion of Poland. September 17th, 1939. Soviet troops invade Poland from the east in hopes to gain some of the Polish land for themselves. America during the early stages of World War II remained isolated due to the fact a majority of the population did not want to go to war again and wanted to stay neutral since World War I. At the same time, a debate was going on between isolationists and interventionists, which nearly led to a revolution among the American people. With Japan refusing to withdraw, the United States stopped exporting the oil to Japan. The oil embargo confirmed Japan's decision to eliminate the United States Pacific Fleet and to conquer Southeast Asia, thereby becoming self-sufficient in crude oil and other vital resources. To try to gain access to Japan in order for invasion, the United States took over many small Pacific islands to get closer to their enemy. The location of these islands was a deciding factor in the outcome of the conflict between the United States and Japan. Russia's geography played a large role in its impenetrability. Its harsh climate and massive size, which prevented German invasion, stopped World War II from continuing for a much longer period of time. Then came the attack on Pearl Harbor.
yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The facts of yesterday and today speak for themselves. With confidence in our armed forces, with the unbounding determination of our people, we will gain the inevitable triumph, so help us God. I ask that the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
During the early stages of World War II, German physicists discovered that the Nazis were making a uranium bomb capable of causing mass destruction. Soon, Albert Einstein informed President Franklin D. Roosevelt, who was urged to form a development team to build this massive weapon called the atomic bomb, codenamed the Manhattan Project. Years later, the project was completed and tested successfully. On August 6, 1945, Americans dropped a little boy on the city of Hiroshima, killing hundreds of thousands of civilians. But the Japanese refused to surrender.
I saw an aircraft
3 days
like
later,
a tiny
on
silver
August 9,
drop entering the sky
1945,
above
another bomb
Hiroshima.
called Fat Man was dropped on Nagasaki, bringing the
I
death toll
instantly
to over
recognized it as an American
225,000.
plane, as no Japanese aircraft could fly at that altitude at the time. It was just one plane, so I assumed that it was passing by as usual.
And I was counting. 1, 2, 3.
I was wiping the desktop. That was when the bomb was dropped.
It took about 45 seconds from the time the bomb left the airplane until it exploded. And I think there wasn't a man in the airplane that wasn't either timing it with his watch or counting or doing something. I was sure the bomb was a dud. I was sure it wasn't going to work.
After falling for 43 seconds, the time and barometric triggers started the firing mechanism. A uranium bullet fired down a barrel into a uranium target. Together, they started a nuclear chain reaction. Solid matter began to come apart, releasing untold quantities of energy.
In World War II, there was new technology such as aerial warfare, like the V-1, also known as the Buzz Bomber. Atomic bombs were also created at the time, such as the Little Boy. And radars were giving knowledge about the enemy's whereabouts. While soldiers were fighting on the front lines, American citizens were contributing to the war effort by doing such things such as rationing consumer goods, recycling materials, purchasing war bonds, and working in war industries that contributed for those who were fighting on the home front. Railroads relied heavily on diesel fuel in order to transport tons of materials, goods, and troops to fight the Axis powers after the bombings of Pearl Harbor. Without these railroads, the Allies would not be able to win this war. During the war, at least 2 million women worked in factories. The GDP in 1945 was $233 million. With that amount of money, factories were able to produce at least 88,000 tanks, 600,000 jeeps, 40 million bullets, 7,000 warships, and 300,000 aircraft. With that amount of firepower, it's enough to win a war within a week. It wasn't long after America entered World War II that Japanese Americans were being put into internment camps along the West Coast in fear of any Japanese American code talking. After the war, an influx of immigrants from Northern and Western Europe, especially Jews, came to the United States, with a majority of them being female. These Estonian refugees who sailed to Florida to escape Russian domination were granted immigration visas by the President Truman on November 2nd, 1946. During World War II, two alliances were formed, known as the Allies and the Axis powers. On the Allied side included the United States, Britain, China, and the Soviet Union. On the other hand, the Axis powers included Germany, Italy, and Japan. On August 15th, 1945,
World War II
Japan surrenders and formally signed the surrender on September 2nd,
came to an end here.
bringing the war to
September
an end.
2nd, 1945. A solemn ceremony on the deck of the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. A mighty warship and a peace to celebrate. The ship was packed with hundreds of sailors, Marines, reporters, cameramen, and top military brass with legendary names: Nimitz, Halsey, Wainwright, McCain, representatives of 9 Allied nations, and Supreme Allied Commander General Douglas MacArthur. Just before 9 that morning, the Japanese representatives approached the Missouri. They boarded in silence, took their places, and the brief ceremony began.
It is my earnest hope, and indeed the hope of all mankind, that from this solemn occasion a better world shall emerge out of the blood and carnage of the past.
MacArthur was about to become the interim ruler of Japan, and the Japanese people, defeated and afraid, did not know what to expect until this moment.
I announce it my firm purpose to proceed in the discharge of my responsibilities with justice and tolerance.
Justice and tolerance. With those words, one Japanese delegate later said, "The deck of the Missouri was transformed into an altar of peace." The Japanese foreign minister signed the instrument of surrender, followed by the Army Chief of Staff. General MacArthur signed. Eyewitnesses saw his hands tremble. The Allied nations signed as well, bearing witness to the end of the worst war in human history. World War II finally was over.
Let us pray that peace be now restored to the world, and that God will preserve it always. These proceedings are closed.
At that moment, as if on cue, the sun came out, and as the Japanese departed, a stunning aerial display. More than 2,000 Allied aircraft flew in formation over the Missouri. In Washington, President Harry Truman marked the moment.
The thoughts and hopes of all America, indeed of all the civilized world, are centered tonight on the battleship Missouri.
It was no accident that the surrender took place aboard the Missouri. The ship was named for Truman's home state. The previous year, then Senator Truman watched his daughter christen the Missouri as it was launched into New York Harbor. Just weeks after the surrender, the ship was back in New York, welcomed by thousands, including President Truman. He visited the spot where the war had ended. He sat at the surrender table to sign the guest book and described it as the happiest day of his life. Today, with this plaque marking its now famous deck, the Missouri is anchored where World War II began for the United States. Mighty Mo now stands proudly and at peace at Pearl Harbor.
Hey NBC News fans, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.
The Civil Rights Movement began to spark as African Americans took to the battlefield in hopes of being treated equal in the military. These soldiers paved the way for interrogation of the U.S. military. Women's contribution, behind and occasionally even on the front lines, made it impossible to keep them in the status of secondary citizens. After the war, new machines were being invented, such as electric washers, televisions, dryers, and more. Transportation and communication became more cheap and new installments were made, such as motels and gas stations. But look, no work. The effects of the war pulled America out of isolationism and became more involved during the Cold War. These include international affairs, but at the same time, people demanded a restriction in immigration. The United States and the Soviet Union emerged as superpowers. The Soviet Union added its countries into Soviet socialist republics. Stalin had drawn an iron curtain across the eastern half of Europe, while America obtained naval bases in Europe and had a monopoly on nuclear weapons. America has recovered from the Great Depression, and President Franklin D. Roosevelt has mobilized the economy, spending billions of dollars on national defense, sending net manufacturing defenses to Britain and the Soviet Union. These include 17 million new civilian jobs were created, industrial productivity increased by 96%, corporate profits doubled after taxes, expansion of consumer goods, increased wages, and created new technology. World War II helped pull the United States out of the Great Depression, making the United States a rich, prosperous nation. The United States and the Soviet Union emerged as the world's two superpowers. The prospect of the communist expansion prompted a group of nations to form the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and the Soviet Union formed the Warsaw Pact. Soon, both superpowers began using their spheres of influence on countries around the world, leading to the infamous Cold War. The end.